Hey everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's Meet the Analyst webinar, How CMOs Can Align with the Business to Drive Success. I'm your host, Jeremy Goldman, Director of our Marketing and Commerce Briefings at Insider Intelligence, coming to you from our New York City headquarters. And I'm joined by my colleague, Principal Analyst Dave Frankland, also in New York. Hey Dave, great to see you here.
Hey Jeremy, excited to be here.
Before we get into the main presentation, I'd also like to thank Emarsys for making today's webinar possible and welcome Sara Richter, CMO at Emarsys. Sarah's joining us from London. Hey, Sara.
Hey, Jeremy, delighted to be here.
Yeah, a few things before we dive in. We have a ton of information to share, but there's no need to take notes. We'll email you a link to view the slides and the full recording afterwards, but we do want you to participate. We encourage you to submit questions during the presentation. Just use the questions tab below at any time, and I'll do my best to get to as many as I can during the Q&A, so please keep them coming. And with that, Dave, let's get started. What's on the agenda for us today?
Thanks, Jeremy. Today we're talking about chief marketing officers, and we did some research which we published just a couple of months ago where we interviewed about 35 CMOs, B-school professors, industry experts. So we've got some published research on what's going on, and today we're sharing some of that. But really what we're going to hone in on today is one of the challenges that are facing CMOs and how we often see them misaligned with the business. So we want to really zero in on how CMOs can align with the business to help ensure their own success. So we're going to focus on some of the pressures CMOs are facing, some of the plates that they're trying to spin, and then we're going to explain how we think about different CMOs can play different roles inside the organization, and there's a matchmaking job to be done to ensure that alignment. So let's start off with some of the pressures, and I'd start just by saying that there is pressure from all sides, and that's from inside the organization, from the customer, from just macro trends going on in the world. There's pressure from all sides. So we're going to focus in quickly on three areas. As I mentioned, first of all, consumers who are completely raising the stakes, especially as it comes to expectations. I often get asked about what was the impact of the pandemic, and I think in some respects, what's not going to change is we expect things now delivered when we want them. We're aware of supply chain, all these things that just completely make it even tougher for businesses to deliver on what we want. As I say, there's a whole host of things going on in the broader world, whether that's sort of socio-political or whether that's technological and legislative. There's just a lot of different things going on that affect how the CMO does her or his job. And then there's internal relationships, right? So we all have bosses, and it's tough for the CMO to sort of manage those relationships down, across, and sideways inside the organization. So I'll share a little bit of detail on each of these, and then we'll start. Then we can get into sort of what's on the CMO's plate right now. And I'll start with sort of the consumer. And just how divided our attention spans are. For quite a few years now, we've been talking about one of the sort of rarest resources and one of the things we need to earn the permission to receive is the consumer's attention. And today, we're splitting our time across multiple things at the same time. So some research here that just shows that splintered media usage where we're actually watching TV and on our phone or our desktop or whatever else that might be at the same time. So it just makes it's tough enough to catch attention. And then when we catch it, we have to be aware that the consumer, we may not have their undivided attention. Obviously, the last sort of 10-ish years, legislation, regulation around the world focused on privacy, a lot of pushback. Consumers, again, are very, very aware of the fact that marketers capture their data. I think it's entered into general lore that, if you're not paying for the product, you probably are the product. But at the same time, consumers are also have expectations that go with that. So they want something in exchange for it. They want to know that their data is secure. And that it's being used in the way that I'm being told it is being used, and that I'm getting value if I provide some of that data to a marketer. So it just makes it tougher. All of that has to be managed. All of that has to be communicated effectively to the consumer. And when companies get it wrong, consumers will punish them. Some data here from a leader that just shows that everything from a poor product experience that I have or a bad personal experience, but also ones that my family has a bad experience, I can punish that company. And punish in this day and age can mean sort of tweeting about a bad experience or posting it on Facebook. It's also never been easier to switch. It's easy to see where else can I get this service or this product. Easier, like I say, than ever just to sort of say, I'm not willing to put up with this. I'm going to move elsewhere. And on the way out the door, I may sort of scorch the earth and make it a negative experience for everyone involved. I have found Twitter to be my complaining channel of choice, often because I get a response and things get resolved. And so companies are having to manage that, not always within the CMO's purview, but to the extent that it's direct communication with the customer, it generally is going to come back to something that the CMO is engaged with. I mentioned at the start, political and social issues. And I sort of think about this in a couple of ways. I think you can look at companies that have always done a great job of marrying their brand up with issues. So companies like Patagonia often get held up for the amazing job they do as it relates to environmental issues. But it's no longer just the sort of what's in your wheelhouse issues. We saw in Atlanta a couple of years ago, companies that are based in Georgia, like Coca-Cola, Home Depot, Delta, got pulled into the debate about voting rights in Georgia, for example. So it's not as straightforward as it once was. And it's very hard for some companies to come down on one side versus the other.
And Dave, I'm glad that you put this in here, because this to me seems like it's one of the biggest shifts in the stories that we're covering lately is, as you said, it seems like it's every day that a brand is brought into a particular story. And it just seems to be a skill set that a CMO needs now that maybe they didn't even need to have, or certainly not. It wasn't as in vogue to have a CMO be a leader in this front, maybe 5-10 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think on the one hand is, like I say, you've got that Patagonia type example, or Nike's another good example, who has always been a little sort of either very forthright or edgy in terms of what they decided to communicate about. But you look at the situation in Ukraine, where every brand was expected to communicate what they were doing and why they were doing it. You have situations like in Florida, Disney, employees really pushing them to take a stance on what became known as the Don't Say Gay bill. And then when they took a stance, there was negative backlash on the other side. We're such a divided country that it's hard. And then internationally, H&M got into a lot of trouble in China because they made the decision, which in the West was seen as a positive decision, to stop buying cotton from the region where the Rohingya, the Uyghurs were being held allegedly in camps. That it became, it's very hard to sort of determine. So CMO is best positioned within the organization to help guide what we should do and why we should do it. I mentioned regulation. That is a moving target, and it's also a resource drain. CMOs, there's legislation around a variety of topics. I touched on privacy earlier. Obviously, internationally, that's a challenge. The European Union has led the way to a large degree here, but Brazil, the US, variety of geographies have followed suit. But in the US, we have this sort of patchwork of legislation by state that makes it really, really difficult to both maintain the relationship and stay compliant with the legislative requirements. And that compliance just requires investment, focus. It requires technology. It requires expertise. It's very, very hard for companies to just even keep up with what the changes are and then stay compliant with them. So it's tougher than ever to get that right. But it does unfortunately require investment and time. I mentioned external factors, just to jump on one here, an obvious one, sort of technology changes. Everything from cookie deprecation to decisions that platforms like Google, Apple, and others make as it relates to access to third-party data, just makes it really, really difficult for marketers to keep up. And I think there's a requirement, to your point, Jeremy, about what's changed in the last few years. The level of technical expertise or savviness that a CMO needs. They don't need to be a technologist. It's not like they need to be an engineer, but they must be able to engage in the conversation. And frankly, probably the most important they can do is ask the right questions and understand the answers. So it requires some of their focus to sort of make sure that they are conversant in those topics, which again are continuing to evolve. And then internal relationships have a huge impact on the CMO success. There's sort of a squeeze from inside the organization. In recent years, companies have added new roles that range from chief digital officer to chief customer officer to chief experience officer, chief revenue officer, chief brand officer. There's this slew of different titles at that level. And those titles in some cases can be fungible from company to company, but the emergence of these roles means the CMO has to work with more people where and when they exist. And it has to be clear who does what, so that you avoid those turf wars within the organization.
By the way, about that, not to try to stump you here, but which of those relationships is the most important? Because you're right, there's a lot more power sharing in some of the companies that you and I are covering. And, it just seems to me, are there certain of those relationships that are more important than others to have a winning CMO in 2022?
So I think it depends to a certain extent on the organization and how they're structured. Some of those titles might not exist within certain organizations. I'm going to use your question actually to segue. So as part of the research, as I mentioned, we interviewed about 35 different experts, and the one role that every single person that I interviewed mentioned was actually the CFO. In some of the, and again, we interviewed from the largest companies in the world to small upstarts, but it was interesting just how many people sort of said that they're having breakfast once a week with the CFO. They're in meetings regularly with the CFO. And a lot of that has to do with sort of aligning with what are the financial metrics that the marketing department can impact. Are we heading in the right direction? Are we measuring the right thing? And also, all of those things I just talked about, they require investment. It's moving marketing from being seen as that cost center to a profit center. And that might be a risk mitigation issue, or it might be something that's driving revenue, but certainly something that was the number one role that I heard from all of those interviews. The other key one I'll mention is actually the CIO. So again, as marketers have a bigger impact on product, on the customer experience, website, whatnot, the marketing technology budget is growing. I'm sure we'll hear some of this from Sara later. Just that importance of the relationship with the CIO. And as I said, sort of that need for the marketer to become more technically savvy, whether that's just being able to ask the right questions or whether it's really understanding the interoperability of different platforms, for example. So let's pivot a little bit and talk about the marketer's remit. It's really hard to be a chief marketer today. Marketers are being asked to do more, frankly, than almost any other function in the C-suite. So there's some phenomenal research by Kim Whitler at Darden Business School at the University of Virginia. She actually looked at what are the specs of CMOs versus other members of the C-suite, and found that marketers are responsible for more than their sort of C-suite brethren. She also pointed out actually that many chief marketers don't necessarily have a marketing education. So she sort of says, imagine that you hire a CFO that doesn't have a finance background, or a head of engineering that doesn't have an engineering background. It wouldn't happen. But marketers, again, being asked to do a lot and coming at it from different points of view. And one of the negative impacts of that is it's tough to be a marketer. They are at the lowest tenure in their roles that we've seen in the last decade. So the most recent data we have, we're waiting on the 2021 numbers from Spencer Stewart. The most recent data we have shows that 2020 was the lowest since 2010 in terms of tenure. So curious to see how that goes. And what's interesting is in that time frame, the CEO tenure has actually increased. So a lot of stuff falling to the marketer and a lot of them falling as a result. But what we found is that the role just continues to expand. And as I say, there's a lot of plates to spin. So what I'm going to do is go relatively quickly through all of those elements that we heard. And then I'm going to use that to sort of talk about areas of strength and areas of interest that marketers might have. And the importance of marrying that up with what the area of need is for the business. So let's start off with just the voice of the customer. Marketing has always been a critical role in understanding the customer. And we think of this as both sort of the insights to understand and then the advocacy for the customer. There's the notion of driving revenue, as I say, whether that's sort of the performance marketing, measuring the impact of the campaigns, or whether that's increasingly marketers are responsible for innovation inside the company. Engaging with the customer, again, whether that's broadcast advertising or whether that's a one-to-one communication through SMS, email, whatever that might be, that communication, and also the experience of that, that the consumer has from that communication. How personalized is it? Not just in terms of, hi, Dave, but is this something that's relevant to me and that's welcomed by me? Obviously, for a long time, the original chief marketer, if you like, was responsible for brand strategy and emotion, increasingly brand equity. And then I've talked about it a couple of times now, but just increasingly the importance of technology and data, and not just data, obviously, but insights and intelligence. So let's go through this relatively quickly, since I've sort of outlined it quickly there. But as it relates to the voice of the customer, obviously, this is all these things are interconnected too, right? So understanding what is the data we have inside the organization about the customer, how can we bring it together? And in this day and age, the data we have about the customer has evolved significantly too, right? So it's not just name, age, and zip code. It's what aisle are they standing in? Are they likely to return products? All those types of things. So really getting into understanding them as an individual, not just the sort of broad stuff that we might have in the past looked at. And then increasingly being the advocate for the customer inside the organization. So the voice of the customer historically has been a capture mode, and then used to often just sort of determine what's the next thing I'm going to send. Increasingly, the marketer is helping to influence policy, product, financial decisions based on what we know about the customer. Next thing I touched on was revenue growth, and we've seen this rise of performance marketing, especially in sort of upstart brands. Insert tech at the end of the industry, so retail tech, fintech, whatever it might be, DTC, etc. You see a huge emphasis on performance marketing in some of those industries, but it's not exclusive. As I said, that relationship with the CFO is critical for a reason. And then, like I mentioned, increasingly we're seeing the CFO being brought into driving innovation, and that may be product, but not exclusively product, right? So all sorts of different strategic decisions being made. A lot of it, as I say, these things are interconnected, harkening back to what do we know about the customer? If we truly have insights and intelligence on the customer, we should be driving strategic decisions and innovation for the business. From a brand point of view, that emotional connection with the consumer has always been critical. It's always been a core function of the marketer's job. What was interesting, and especially in some of the bigger organizations I spoke with, was the CMOs talking about brand equity. What's the value of the brand? What's the financial impact of the brand? And how do I measure that moving forward? From an engagement point of view, again, often the CMO's team is a primary, certainly on the outbound typically, and increasingly working with, you asked about other roles they're working with service or customer care, whatever it might be called, but sort of coordinating what we're saying, how we're saying it across touch points. So, omni-channel became the phrase du jour for a while. It doesn't really matter what we call it. The point is, as consumers, we want it to be relevant to us in a timely fashion, and welcomed when we receive it, and that's tough to get right at a mass scale. And that notion of experience, it's the sort of what do I walk away from the interaction with the company? How much friction is there in the engagement I have, and how can we make that better? All of that typically falling to the CMO. And then technology, whether that's I need to be conversant in AI and the metaverse and blockchain, or whether it's where is all my data, how does it operate, how do I integrate it, how do I normalize it, how do I analyze it. All of those are conversations that the CMO has to have, whether they're directly responsible for it or they're an internal customer of another group that's responsible for this. So really, really tough to do all of these things. It's very hard to understand what's going to tug on my customers' emotional heartstrings, while thinking about how do we drive the business forward, while thinking about what's the strategic direction, while thinking about where's my data sitting, how am I going to analyze it, what's the right experience. It's very, very tough to do all of these things and to be responsible for them all. And so what I want to zero in on is this notion of alignment. And I think of it in three main ways. First of all, there's alignment with the business, which was surprising to me how often that came up in interviews. CMOs sort of, when you ask them, what would you recommend to someone starting out in this role? What would you do? And the number of people who just sort of said the first thing you have to do is figure out how marketing ties to the strategy of the business. So at the highest end, folks are driving the strategy. Others are struggling to connect what they're doing with the strategy of the business. I'm going to pick up last year's marketing plan, look at my metrics, see if I can improve them. That's not enough anymore. It's genuinely like, where are we going as a business? Hopefully helping to inform that. But if at a minimum, tying everything I'm doing to that, and that gives the permission structure then to help shape the strategy, to be the customer advocate and all those other things we talked about. A slightly more subtle element that came up in several interviews was this notion of leadership style. So if I'm primarily responsible for driving revenue, I'm probably looking for somebody with a bit more of an entrepreneurial sales kind of mindset versus somebody who is brand oriented. I'm looking for that traditional sort of creative strategic thinker. And while those things are similar, there are differences. And I think it's really important to get that leadership style dialed in and appropriate for the business that folks are working in. And then understanding CMO archetypes. So this is where we see the most opportunity for alignment. And I think there's a few things to do here, as we wrote down, sort of, you've got to start with it looking inward first. What am I really, really good at? And what do I enjoy? And then what's a company looking for? And do these things line up? And I think what's a company looking for isn't just looking at the job description. I think it's, what does the CEO enjoy doing? Somebody I spoke to talked about it in a previous role. Their CEO was all about the customer. All they wanted to do was be that sort of what we would think of as a sort of a quote unquote CX type role. And so they sort of realized that I'm on a collision course here. It's very hard for me to wrestle this from the CEO. So I can either focus on the things that the other aspects of my remit and let that go, or I can go, if that's what I'm passionate about, I can go and do that in another organization, which is ultimately what the person chose to do. So like I say, it has to start with some introspection, skills. We all think we're great at everything, ask others, and an honest assessment of what you're passionate about. Some people love looking at spreadsheets all day. Some people can't stand it. That's a really obvious example, but there's things that you can do to just sort of gauge where you want to go. So let's jump into these archetypes with that as an understanding of how to use it. And we identified 5 key archetypes that we found. And first one is a strategy focused CMO. So these are folks that help to set the company's vision. And vision here isn't just the words, our company exists to. This is genuinely sort of looking forward. Where are we going as a business? What's changing in the marketplace? What's changing with our competitive set? What's changing with our customers? And what do we need to do about it? It's real strategy, which in some organizations might fall to the CEO, might fall to a chief strategy officer. Again, no two organizations are the same, right? But what you see here is the emphasis on customer understanding, on innovation, and as it relates to brand, more of an emphasis on brand equity and the value that this is going to do than on the sort of emotion side of things. As you can see, sort of, the allies tend to be the senior most, the CEO, chief strategy officer, but they may also overlap. Some of those people, like a chief strategy officer, might actually be doing this function inside the organization. So this is what I mean by it's important to be strategic. As once you have a C in your title, you're a strategic player, but are you driving the strategy of the business, or are you driving the strategy of your department? And these are folks that are driving the strategy of the business. Next is the revenue-focused CMO. As I mentioned, we see this a lot in upstart companies. The whole focus on performance marketing. These guys are incredibly agile, very focused on measurement, understand a lot of emphasis on test and learn, tend to be quite technical. Again, they've really figured out how to leverage technology, how to leverage data and insights and like I say, the measurement side of that to optimize all of the decisions I'm making.
And Dave, actually, this is something that we were covering a little bit in one of our briefings. I feel like this archetype is kind of relevant to the Unilever news, going away from the CMO title, just citing the shifting, blurring lines between different functions, and just the fact that performance and tying marketing efforts back to revenue is just so commonplace these days.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting example, because I think you see in, like I say, in those sort of upstart companies, the chief revenue officer title, who are responsible for both sales and marketing. What's really interesting with Unilever, historically within CPG, there was a CMO sitting at corporate, and then all of the brands, the brand manager was where things got executed, sort of thing. And I think with the rise of DTC, some of these CPG companies have really woken up to the idea that they can have these direct relationships with customers. They're not only selling through retailers, grocery stores, whatever else. And so that emphasis on revenue now it's happening in every industry, as you say. I think it's a great example. Absolutely. The next group we mentioned is the brand focused CMO, and you still find these guys. This is the classic CMO to some extent, right? It's I'm responsible for everything from the brand image to the 30-second ad. I really understand the emotional impact of each of those activities, and I'm sort of building that equity in my brand. And so you look at sort of what we've traditionally thought of as best marketing companies in the world. So much of it came back to their brand. And so these guys absolutely still exist. What's interesting, as I said here, sort of potential overlapping roles, is there are some organizations where you see there's now a chief brand officer that's distinct from the chief marketing officer. And in those organizations, this role is basically, this brand focus is the brand officer, and the marketer is doing some of those other plate spinning. So it's a great example of sort of understanding your strengths, business needs, and thinking about alignment. Engagement focus. So these are folks that, again, very technical, really leveraging technology to engage with the customer. Think about what's the right message, right time. That old cliche that we still struggle with, but how do I figure out what's relevant to my customer and get that in front of them at the point of interaction? Thinking about it as, how do I solve the customer need in the moment? I've spent a lot of my career working with these guys, having grown up in the sort of customer intelligence world, because of that emphasis on understanding the customer, such that I can then think about what's the right thing for me to put in front of them. And then the technical side of that is knowing, yesterday I sent them an email, I'm not sending them an SMS today, unless I'm doing that for a reason. But thinking about it, the interconnection of all of those things. And our fifth archetype is what we called experience-focused CMO. My colleague, or our colleague, Patty Saltis, is going to be writing on the chief customer officer. So in some organizations, we're seeing the rise of the chief customer officer responsible for experience. And that's both sort of, what do we know about the customer? How do we measure that? How do we remove friction from all across the interaction points? And I think that's where you see probably the biggest difference between a chief customer officer and the experience-focused CMO. The experience-focused CMO is focused on the experience of the marketing versus the entire experience typically. Again, exceptions prove the rule. There are some organizations where the CMO sort of is also the chief customer officer or chief experience officer, but often we find that there's an experience-focused CMO who cares so much about what's how does the website render? Are we delivering the right experience? How can we remove friction from clicking, collecting, what all of those elements. In other organizations, they'll fall to other roles. So that's a fairly fast tour through all of these archetypes. It's written in such a way that somebody could take this, look at it, think about, again, their strengths, think about the organization needs, and the alignment, unfortunately, is on you. We can only do so much from in general, but that's how it's intended to be used. So with that, Jeremy, let me hand it back over to you for the next phase, and look forward to the Q&A.
That was great. And by the way, I feel, Dave, I don't know if you could hear this. I feel like I could hear the screenshots, that sound going off. Especially the last few slides. But guys, everybody, we told you we are going to send you the slides. I can definitely imagine those last few being especially helpful to our audience. That was really great, Dave. And before we get to questions live, we're having a bunch of great questions come in. Feel free to still submit. But right now, we are joined by Emarsys CMO, Sara Richter. And not only is she a CMO herself, she's also working with CMOs every day. So I'm glad that we have the chance to talk to you, and I'm eager to hear your perspective.
Thanks, Jeremy. I'm excited for our chat.
So I have a few questions for you. One, Dave spoke about how privacy-minded consumers are wary of data usage, pushing CMOs to ultimately tailor their offerings. And because of this, it's crucial for brands to develop an omni-channel strategy. This is something that we cover quite often. Can you speak to steps that they're taking to achieve this level of sophistication?
Sure, absolutely. So from my perspective, the very first thing is actually the mindset of the CMO themselves. A CMO, to be successful in omni-channel, needs to be truly customer obsessed. And that is easier said than done. We're doing some research at the moment that suggests that really only about 58% of CMOs have made that shift. So that's something that's happening. And as they are making it, they're starting to be really able to embrace omni-channel. Once you're thinking that way, you need to be aligning with your head of CRM, your head of digital. Dave touched on allies within the organization. Your allies must be people who can help you gain that real understanding of your data. How is it being acquired? How is it being used? How are you trying to drive the experience for your consumer? Because this is what's going to drive your strategy. Before you do anything else, you need to be clear on that. And we know that marketing teams often struggle with this. And so actually at Emarsys, we try to run workshops with marketing teams to really get to grips with what that strategy should look like before the CMO takes the dive into buying technology. Because the reality is you can't run an omni-channel strategy in this day and age without technology. We all know that. But it's really dangerous to go pick the tech and then build the strategy afterwards. You're always going to have a mismatch. But
I'm glad that, sorry,
go ahead.
No, you first.
Once you've done that, you need to make sure when you've got the strategy, I would personally recommend you're looking for something that's really going to help you move quickly. You don't have time in the current digital age to be slow about this. So you need a platform that's actually going to move you through it quickly and get you business results extremely quickly. And if you look at how some of our customers are using our platform, they're doing exactly that. And they're seeing things like increase in database size, increase in engagement via those key channels, and most importantly, increase in revenue. And that tells you that your strategy is now impacting the bottom line and the strategy of the business.
Yeah, and I was actually kind of curious because as you started talking about technology, I was wondering, CMOs are forced to do everything they can right now to increase their longevity because at the end of the day, the CMO is a job and longevity for the job is going down. They're needing to tie marketing to the strategies of their business as much as possible in order to stay in those roles. So how can technology support this? Maybe you can talk a bit more about that.
Sure. Actually, I'd like to answer that without sharing the experience of a customer, some Samsonite. And I recently had the privilege of spending some time with the CMO of Samsonite. And obviously all the challenges you're talking about are always there for the CMO. But if you think in the last couple of years with COVID, it's only gotten worse. And then you add for a brand like Samsonite, who's fundamentally a luggage manufacturer. They're a retailer and they're a retailer in travel, right? Two of the industries that without a doubt have had some of the biggest struggles in the last 2 years. Their entire business strategy had to change. What customers were buying for different reasons, or they weren't buying. They were engaging in different ways. They weren't in places like airports picking up an extra piece of luggage. So they had to pivot their entire digital marketing strategy to support this, to engage with customers in different ways, in different channels, at different times, and potentially actually promoting different products. The CMO spoke about flipping from luggage to backpacks because that was something that people were still using, for example. And they were super successful at it. And they've actually decreased their customer churn and increased their loyalty. And they've done that by having a customer engagement platform that allowed them to engage with their customers through all these digital channels, even in the midst of all the turmoil that all of us in the company were experiencing.
I'm glad that you brought a client example, and especially when it's relevant, because I think that perfectly answers the question. It's interesting. I also want to ask you, I feel like 10 years ago, I heard about silos, and 5 years ago, I heard about silos, and it still seems like that as a whole, that's a major problem, data silos. And I'm wondering, how are CMOs helping, themselves and their longevity by cutting across those silos and establishing a more holistic approach to the customer journey?
Yeah, but I think the silo is the Achilles heel of customer experience and customer journeys, right? If you don't break it down, you cannot be successful, certainly not in a world where your customer is moving from digital to face and back to digital again so quickly. If your data and your experience is defined by those silos, then you're never going to bridge those gaps. So what you have to do is have a CMO who understands that and looks at themselves as the expert of the customer, right? They understand, so they're connecting, back to Dave's point about allies again, they're connecting the different parts of the organization. To stick with the theme, we have a customer in Australia, Q Clothing, who did some extremely innovative things around this to actually get to the point where the digital things that they were doing in some of their stores were actually significantly driving face-to-face purchases and back and forth again. So actually a strategy that used the data across all those different channels, but that actually had a positive impact to the bottom line, which was really, really exciting.
That's great. Yeah, no, that was really fantastic. Thanks, Sarah. We have some other questions for you, and maybe we can bring Dave in for this as well as part of our Q&A. It's time to get into that audience Q&A, and we've received a lot of great questions, so let's dive into that. One thing I was kind of curious about as well, so I'm glad somebody asked this, do we have any type of breakdown of what percentage of specific archetypes exist across particular industries? Are there, Dave, I'm wondering if you've seen that, is it weighted in a certain way? So, pharma tends to go this way and CPG tends to go another way, or is there any other way that we can kind of break down those archetypes that you presented before?
So you know how much I love not having data, Jeremy, right? We don't have sort of percentages across. What I would say is that, like, even as we were talking about the Unilever example earlier, and I mentioned sort of insurtech, fintech, et cetera, there are some more obvious places than others. I think CPG historically has had that brand focused CMO. Like I said, then you have the brand manager that was responsible for some of those other elements. Strategy focus, to be honest, seems to cut across from the people I interviewed. That's as much a person as it is as it would be an industry, for example. Engagement focus often in traditional sort of quote unquote direct channels. So you think of traditional within retail, it might be the traditional sort of more catalog driven DTC. Within travel, financial services, where the card business, for example, heavy emphasis on the engagement focus. So it really depends on the element of the business. And then again, sort of what I would love to dig into, but it's probably more of an academic piece of research than we might do, but to sort of dig into what are all of the factors, because you'd have to look at how's the organization structured, what are the other roles, what's the need, what's the strategy of the business, and how is all of that impacting the type of CMO that they need. And then you'd want to look at that over time to say, was it the right person in the right role, right? Because I think that's our entire premise here, is a lot of companies are getting this wrong. Again, Kim Whitler, who I mentioned at Darden, did some academic research on this, and her belief is that there is actually a mismatch in organizations that needs to get fixed as well. So she was one of the people I really keyed in on as part of that research.
That's great. Sarah, you have any thoughts there?
It's such a wide-ranging topic. I mean, I think it's really fascinating to see where people are gravitating towards and how companies are going to match what their requirements are, perhaps a bit better with the people that are coming to them and what are delivering. And I think if looking at some of the archetypes specifically, people, it's going to be interesting to see if they recognize themselves as they start to look at the survey and see where do they identify, and then how does that impact their career paths or perhaps the value they think they should be delivering to an organization.
So we got another great question, which is similar and yet not. Do you believe it's beneficial or detrimental for companies to make statements or take stands on key social topics via social media? Is it better to stay silent or take a side? I imagine you guys might say something along the lines of "it depends" and then go into it, but tell me if I'm wrong.
I can take a start here. I'm actually finishing up some research at the moment, Jeremy, on marketing to the values-driven consumer, we're calling it. And you are correct. There is no straightforward answer. What I would say, it all comes back to what's in the business's interest and what's the business issues that they care about. So I used the Patagonia example earlier. Really easy for them to say, this is an environmental issue. We care deeply about it. It should be easy for others to do similar. Not everyone does it as well as Patagonia. So I mentioned the Atlanta-based companies. I mentioned Disney, right? So I think increasingly you don't get to decide, right? That I think is part of the challenge. Is you may think this is an issue we want to steer clear of, and you may not get a choice. But what's been really interesting as I look at this is organizations that think about this in advance, think about what are the issues that are relevant to us and what are the ones that are not, communicate that in advance, especially internally. I think if employees understand, this is not an issue we're going to take a stand on because these are the things that matter. These are the things that are core to our business. These are the things that we care deeply about, but then you have to be consistent. If we care about gender equality, what's your pay gap? It's not enough just to sort of put out a social post on International Women's Day and say how important all of our female employees are. That needs to filter through everything you do. There was actually somebody set up a Twitter bot in the UK where if you've got more than 250 employees, you have to disclose your gender gap. And every British-based company that tweeted on International Women's Day, the bot just responded right away with what the gender gap is. And in some cases, women were getting paid more than men. In some cases, it was a very, very tight margin. In other cases, it was absurd. It was 40, 50% pay gap, and yet they're tweeting about how important women are to their business. So I think that consistency is sometimes as important as the issue itself and the stance you take. Is this core to who we are? Does it fit with our values? And therefore we're going to take a stance, and therefore we're not going to take a stance, and communicate why not.
We have we actually have two that I think I might kind of ask simultaneously. Just to keep you guys on your feet, is proliferation of C-level titles a threat to the CMO role itself in terms of like the chief revenue officer, the chief purpose officer? Are these usurping? It's
a new one
on
me, actually.
Yeah, well, I know a few of them, actually. I'll introduce you. Are these usurping the CMO's responsibilities over time and the CMO role becoming redundant? And I almost wonder if that's, we had another question about the Unilever CMO role shifting. Are those two things related, which is just that the CMO skills are important, but they might not necessarily be called the CMO in all organizations?
I mean, I think it's about, I'll take a pass at that to start with. The title is, in my world, slightly less relevant than what it is you're delivering and what are you bringing to the organization, right? So, I mean, that the fact that we've been called CMOs today, that's fine, but what is it we're doing and how do you think about that? And how is that relevant not just to you, but to your customers, right? And to your marketplace? And how are you presenting the face and the strategy and your brand to the greater world? I think, however, and Dave touched on this, fundamentally, marketers are being asked to do more and more. They're not being asked to do less. Responsibility is not being taken away. In fact, we've been talking, we have a bit of a series going, and that's some things that we've been doing, that time is actually currently the marketer's biggest, most valuable item, because there's so little of it, because you're being asked to do so much and you're spread so thin. How do you make the most of the time you have so that you have the maximum impact on the business? And I actually think that's more relevant than worrying about whether whether your title is changing ever so slightly. Dave, I don't know if you feel differently.
I agree 100%. And what I would say is, I would think of this as, just take it out of marketing for a second. Titles are changing everywhere, right? So HR is chief people officer and chief whatever, talent officer, this, that, and the other. And to Sarah's point, it's sort of, call me what you want. Like, let's get aligned on what you need me to do. Is it something that I feel like I'm better than anyone else in the world to do? And let me go do it. And let's align on, this is our goal. This is going to be the impact of it. This is how we're going to measure it. Now let me go and crush it. And if you want to call me chief marketing officer, chief something else officer, whatever it is, that's okay, as long as we are in alignment. Again, it comes back to our core theme for today.
We had another question that I think is really interesting. Are CMO budgets at risk for not getting increased funding next year? And if so, which areas are they looking to invest in versus reduce, like invest more in MarTech or reduce agency costs, things like that? Are there any things that you're hearing from your conversations with CMOs? And I guess, maybe we can start with Sarah.
Sure. So I think CMO budgets are always at risk, right? That's if you're the sensible CMO knows that's always a challenge, right? I think they're at risk from the areas where you cannot demonstrate that you're driving the strategy, to Dave's point, impacting the bottom line in a positive way, right? Business outcomes. We talk about that a lot as a company, but that, in the market now is, what are you doing from a marketing perspective to actually demonstrate that you're having a positive impact, not just on the business outcomes for marketing, but for the business as a whole, and then aligning that to where your spend is. I clearly have a slightly prejudiced view on this, but I will say that I don't think that spend on MarTech is under threat if you're demonstrating that you're using that MarTech to drive that strategy, which is what I talked about when you asked me about omnichannel a little while ago. But it goes to the broader marketing strategy. And are you using that to also, what I said, to free up the time of your marketers to go do other things? Are you using that MarTech to automate, to allow you to move faster, to make smarter decisions using things like AI, so that marketers can go and do what they're good at, which is to be creative, to ideate, and to feed into that, and then to actually get more value together out of what you're looking to do?
Yeah, I'd agree, Jeremy. And I think, I think when you look at it on pure numbers, for the same thing over years, certain things are under threat and certain things are growing. So linear TV advertising, which was for a long time the CMO's biggest line item, may be declining. But that could possibly be because your customers are now on TikTok and not watching nightly news, kind of thing. So I think the overall budget, and I agree with Sarah, by the way, on MarTech, and I sort of think MarTech, not just the sort of platform, but also the data and insights side of that. It may not actually be the CMO's budget, but the organization's budget is constant, if not increasing. We're actually later in the fall, we'll actually be sizing the spend on MarTech and forecasting that out over the next few years. But anecdotally, my sense is that is holding steady at worst, and anecdotally, I would say it's probably increasing.
Okay, yeah, I think that maybe we have got time for about one more. So maybe just like a nice prescriptive one to end on for today. We got a question about skills. What skills do you both think are in most demand for the CMOs of today, as opposed to the CMOs of 5 years back? I know we talked about a few things, driving revenue. We obviously talked about brand and how that's not quite deprecated, but that's changing. But what are you seeing from your conversations?
So I would say technology and insights. Again, it's the sort of ability to not you don't need to be able to code, right? But you have to understand what a SaaS platform is, how how interoperable my solutions are. I'd go back to what Sara said in response to your question about strategy has to lead the technology discussion, which doesn't always happen, but you have to be able to have that technology discussion and to understand how all of these elements play together, and just understand are we going to experiment in the metaverse? And if so, how and why? Are we going to experiment with AI, AR, VR, whatever it might be? Should I care about a QR code? Like, all those questions that we get every day, Jeremy. You have to be able to ask the question. You have to understand the answer, and so that requires a technical savvy that wasn't there in the past. And then the insight side of it, again, the most value I think the CMO can bring is asking the right question. They don't have to be able to find the answer, but they have to be able to ask the right question to the right person.
Yeah, I think you hit on the two things I would have picked, Dave. So that's going to sound very boring, but genuinely, it is true, right? Let's start with the data piece of it. If as a CMO, you have to be a data-driven CMO today. That's not an option. It used to be a nice to have, and you need it at your fingertips. And you need to understand the stack that you need to have from a MarTech standpoint to not just go and drive those customer experiences I was talking about, but actually to actually bring you the right data so you can make the right decisions moving forward to impact the strategy, impact the business, impact the outcomes. The two are absolutely married. And I think if you look over time, the CMO role has massively evolved to be enormously focused on those things. And I don't think that's going anywhere soon.
I feel like that's a fantastic note to end on. And unfortunately, that's actually all the time we have for today. But thanks again to Dave for joining us, and a very special thanks to Sara and to the team at Emarsys and our eMarketer production crew behind the scenes. They also deserve a huge thank you for making this webinar possible. As promised, we'll be emailing you soon with a link to the slides and a full recording so you can delete all those screenshots like I told you. And before we wrap up, let me take you just one moment to tell you what's happening across eMarketer's media channels. You can register for upcoming live analyst and tech talk webinars at emarketer.com/webinars. And on the audio side, don't forget to tune into Behind the Numbers, eMarketer's daily podcast at emarketer.com/podcast. And finally, make sure to check out our newsletters. Thank you so much for joining us, and hope you have a great rest of your day.